I want to do a video today on the subject or the question of whether high achieving minority groups in the U.S. are in America. And I want to use as a case study Indian Americans who, one, I think are relatively or don't receive as much attention as I think they merit, and because they in many ways embody all the traits and characteristics of what it means to be a high achieving minority group in the US. But I think that the lessons here are broadly applicable to an array of different groups. So I wanted to, I guess, begin the discussion with by reflecting with the benefit of some hindsight, an article that I had written in May 2013. I have it here. Here it is. The title is Indian Americans Voting Against Their Interest. Now, this article was, I co-authored it with a friend of mine from law school. And the genesis of it basically was that we were reflecting on how Indian Americans as a community have developed so much professional and financial success and so forth, and yet they're voting as a bloc based for the Democratic Party, which is seemingly against their own interests. And we talk in the article about the contrast between the Democratic and Republican Party on issues like taxes and affirmative action and government regulation of healthcare and so forth. And we cited that as an argument for why Indian Americans actually would be better off voting for the Republican Party. Now, there's nothing really in the article that I think factually that's wrong or that was incorrect at the time. But I think as I look back and reflect on that article and also think about what has happened in the 5+ years since we wrote that article, I think the article missed the point in a bigger sense, which is that the threat to Indian Americans was not coming as much from the Democratic Party as it really was from trends in American society that were really a bipartisan phenomenon, but they had just manifested in some ways more so on the left than the right. And what that threat is basically a threat that is all too familiar in throughout the world, and that we've seen in a very serious, gross way in the 20th century, and that is the phenomenon of atrocities against successful minority groups. So if you look at some of the worst atrocities throughout the 20th century, we, I think, have a tendency of attributing them to just evil or human cruelty or things that are happening in a specific place and time. But one of the common denominators that they have is, in fact, that they usually are the byproduct of minority groups becoming very successful in a society, usually in a multi-ethnic or multicultural society, and in doing so provoking outrage from the majority group. And what that usually ends up leading to is stereotypes or theories or so forth, that basically the reason why the minority group is successful is because they're, to quote or to paraphrase Pinker, that they're in some way uniquely ruthless or avaricious, that can lead to theories or accusations that they are to blame for whatever is ailing mainstream society, and then that can lead to basically atrocities ultimately against these minority groups. So the just some examples, the Chinese in Southeast Asia have dealt with this for a long time. Indians in Africa, the Igbo tribe in Nigeria. And then the most common and the worst manifestation of this trend, of course, is global anti-Semitism, which really reached its peak during the Holocaust, but very much remains a a threat. Now, one of the things that is happening is basically that Indian Americans have emerged to some degree the way Asian Americans have generally, but the Indian American story in some way is unique in the sense of how quickly and decisively this minority group has really arrived in the U.S. and acquired a highly disproportionate degree of wealth and power and influence in American society. Now the way this basically happened was that although Indian Americans have been in the country for some time, you can look, for example, in California and some agrarian communities. There were some Punjabis that came there. Really, Indian American power and influence in American society is a byproduct of immigration reforms in the 1960s, where if you look at the Hart-Celler Act, what this basically did was open the door to large numbers of immigrants from all over the world who could come on the basis of their professional skills. And so what ended up happening basically was that you had the very cream of the crop of Indian society, especially professionals, high IQ professionals and so forth, who had advanced degrees, and they recognized that opportunities were available in the US that were not in the sort of socialist, dysfunctional countries and societies that they were leaving. And Indian Americans had the fortune of arriving in the US when a lot of trends within American society were moving in a way that favored them. So unlike African Americans or Jews or Asian Americans who had arrived in the US at an earlier period, much of the work of the civil rights movement was over in the 60s and 70s. So a lot of the very institutionalized forms of discrimination that might have ordinarily plagued a dark-skinned, non-European immigrant group were largely on their way out. And then when you get to the 80s, you have a very significant program led by the Reagan administration, but also by a right-wing tide in American society to deregulate the economy. So you had a major liberalization of the high financial sector, and you had the tax rates going down considerably, especially on upper income earners and so forth. And so this really provided an opportunity to using, in particular, cognitive and technical skills and entrepreneurship to all of a sudden expand and grow and just get very wealthy in a short period of time. And I would argue that the innovation and growth, particularly in the financial sector in the 80s, what it did was it, one, produced just a more globalized economy. It really catapulted the U.S. To the forefront of economic leadership in the world. And then a lot of this manifested in the tech boom of the 90s and the startup culture centered in Silicon Valley, which obviously disproportionately benefited Indian Americans with a tech background coming from major universities and so forth. And all of this has now manifested in a situation where Indian Americans have become extraordinarily powerful and influential in the sense that they are now the wealthiest immigrant group, the wealthiest minority group in the U.S. And this isn't, increasingly, it's not wealth that's just sort of concentrated or as a result of seemingly obscure industries. But if you look at the wealthiest Indian Americans, they're people who not only made their money and their wealth by launching startups and so forth, but they now also are the CEOs and the heads of major companies like Google and Microsoft, Pepsi. I mean, just an array of very powerful interests. And now, especially as this immigrant generation is getting older, and now their kids are coming to the fore, they now have the benefit of the privilege built up by this immigrant generation, and they're now expanding into other sectors of American society. And you see that in the number of Indian Americans who are getting elected to high office or who are getting senior appointments, regardless of the president in power. So this is really an interesting dynamic, and it's a story that can be told to varying degrees of many other high-achieving minority groups, whether it's Chinese Americans, Korean Americans, in a different way, and story of Mormons, and so forth. Now, Indian American, but also the ascendance of other minority groups is happening during a period where a lot of trends are going in a different direction for the majority group, white Americans, in American society. Now, part of this is just a demographic decline where you have just Asian Americans that are the fastest growing minority group. Hispanic immigration, and all of which is basically conspiring just at a very numerical level. White Americans really come to grips with the idea that they might become a minority in a country where they've been the majority for a long time. But it's also provoking what is in the sociology literature called ethno-racial group threat. And so the idea is basically that when you see, humans generally tend to be more moved or motivated by social comparison, like how they rate compared to other people more than their overall gains. And so one of the ways that this is manifesting, for example, is, and I talked about this in a national interest piece that I had done. Here, I'll pull it up here. The subject was on looking at do Republicans in fact want tax cuts, and I wrote this, as you can hopefully see here, or no, maybe you can't, but it was written. Oh yeah, here, December 2016. So this was right after Trump and the Republicans had scored this surprise victory, and a lot of people were anticipating that unified Republican government would presage, like it did in the Reagan years, significant deregulation, lower taxes, and whatever. And I basically predicted the opposite. And one of the reasons I predicted it was because I recognized that there were trends in white America that were basically making white Americans apprehensive about free markets, about deregulation, and so forth, because they knew that that this sort of competitive American society was in many ways cutting against them. And so I wrote that, I'll just read a little bit here. I wrote that one of the factors leading to resistance of white Americans and a cause for concern was a perceived threat from so-called model minorities. And so I wrote that since the late 1980s, growing competition in institutions like higher education, where zero-sum admissions processes gate to the elite, is eroding individualistic meritocratic values in the white upper class. At 3 of the 4 Southern universities that cracked the US News Top 20, Asians represent over a fifth of the student body, numbers unheard of even in the elite Northeast schools of the 1980s. Outlier performance from America's fastest growing and highest earning minority group is triggering a backlash in response to what sociologists call a, quote, ethno-racial outgroup threat, unquote, perceiving Asian achievement as a, quote, impending threat to their, quote, dominant ethno-racial group position. University of Miami sociologist Frank Sampson found in a 2013 study that commitment to meritocratic principles is waning among whites. These sentiments are conspicuous in the suburbs of the New South, like Atlanta, where white flight has persistently followed the arrival of high-tech industries and, quote, too many tiger moms. Amid a 7-fold increase in the suburban Asian population since the Reagan years, the term competition itself, as sociologist Samuel Kai discovered, has become a, quote, and I'm quoting Kai here, a quote, racial code for the tensions that develop between whites and Asians when Asians succeed. Now, my own prediction is that we're only at the beginning of this trend where you're going to see in a multicultural society, a society that's probably becoming more multiracial, increasingly disparate outcomes, where you have at the very top sectors that really matter, that test cognitive ability, Asian Americans and other minority groups basically outcompeting whites. And you're seeing that in higher education, in finance, education, tech, politics. I mean, any society really at the intersection of what matters, which is power, money, and so forth, and that this is going to inevitably, so much of our kind of dialogue since the 1960s has been on this assumption or idea that all groups and people are equal, and that if you level the playing field, that you'll end up seeing a roughly proportionate set of outcomes. But what we're finding, in fact, is the opposite, that the more you have a level playing field, the more you have equal opportunity, the more that certain groups with different cultural and genetic attributes rise to the top and others don't, which is obviously a cause for concern in any multi-ethnic, multiracial society, but particularly one that is so embedded or imbued with the idea of equality. So what does this mean? And my own view is that to a certain degree there will be factions or segments within American society that recognize that immigration and the ability of American society to assimilate and welcome talent from around the world is part of what makes us a vibrant, dynamic society, and that they will recognize that if America can continue to be a magnet for the smartest engineers and doctors and scientists and financial elites and whatever, that this will ultimately, regardless of the distributed outcomes within American society, it's broadly going to be a source of dynamism for the country, and one that ultimately, to use the cliche, lifts all boats. But I think that there's just far too much evidence that that people aren't simply driven by their overall well-being, but that this sense of white Americans really feeling like they're on the way down, that they're about to lose to other minority groups, racial groups who are different from them, and who are sort of seemingly gaining at their expense, is a phenomenon that I think is not going to happen without a fight. And I think that this poses a serious threat to high-achieving minorities and I think minorities of all different groups, but especially those that, in addition to being minorities, are just look different. I think there's, for anyone who is open and willing to look at the literature and the science on this, there is absolutely no question that someone's phenotype, like that, how someone looks, the extent to which they have dark skin or maybe different eyes, or just they look different, absolutely manifests in a different set of attitudes and reactions and fears. So I think in terms of the negative consequences that high achieving minorities can expect to face in the coming years in America, I've identified 8 that I think are likely to happen, and I'll go through them. So number 1 is a national consensus behind progressive taxation, with particularly the areas where white pluralities or majorities can target an Asian community large enough to extract and redistribute significant wealth. So this might happen, for example, in areas where you have like Indian doctors or businessmen in certain family-owned businesses who are making a lot of money, or if you have like a tech sector that tends to draw predominantly certain minority groups. I think that you can expect to see that in particular. Number 2 is a decline in merit-based hiring and admissions processes, with harder and harder quotas, directed against Asians and enforced by a nexus of government, corporations, and academia. So basically, what's going to happen is at some point, there's going to be a recognition that when you have fair, equal based admissions processes and whatever, that leads to that comes at the expense of white Americans, especially the white middle class, and it tends to benefit and favor Asians and other high achieving minority groups. And basically, whatever the rationale is, whether it's diversity or inclusion or whatever the fancy accepted term is for it, basically you're going to see companies, corporations, educational departments, governments find whatever rationale they can to make sure that there aren't too many of a certain minority group, and that all these institutions, to quote Bill Clinton, look like America. Number 3 is going to be rising rates and greater transaction costs associated with moving money and people abroad, particularly to Asia. So basically, there's going to be an effort to try to basically extract value and prevent the kind of ties between Asian ethnic groups in the US and their counterparts and connections that they have in East Asia. Thank you, Kurt. Just let me know if I do it again. And basically to try to mitigate what could be an even greater degree of inequality arising from Asian American groups taking advantage or becoming the beneficiary of rising economic and political growth in the Asian continent generally. Number 4 is a crackdown on immigration and on visa programs that have the effect of separating transnational Asian families and reducing economic competition for whites. So I think more than anything else, this is actually what really accounted for the Trump phenomenon. Trump really recognized the opportunity from really taking on the mantle of being an immigration restrictionist. And if you look at not only the rhetoric, but also the policy, if you look at Senator Jeff Sessions, for example, he was long regarded as an outlier on the immigration issue for how hard of a view he had against immigration. Almost overnight, he basically became the mainstream of the Republican Party. He became Attorney General, and one of the initiatives that he did was really cracking down on visas of high-tech workers, which obviously, if you look at it in this lens of ethnic competition, was benefiting Asians and non-white immigrant groups at the expense of white engineers and people in the tech sector. This is also something actually that Steve Bannon has said, and it got some attention, that he was actually interviewing Donald Trump on the radio. They were talking about immigration, and Trump said, well, yeah, we need to get our borders under control, but you agree, right, that it would be a good idea, nevertheless, to bring in kind of smart, talented people from around the world. And there was an awkward silence, and then Bannon, basically said, well, look, Silicon Valley is becoming majority Asian, and America is not just a economy, it's also a civic society. And then, he kind of trails off, and both he and Trump recognize the direction they're going, and they both back off. But basically the point Bannon was making is that, look, even if Silicon Valley and these tech sectors are benefiting from these Asian immigrants, that does something to America's civil society, which presumably he views as a negative. Actually, you might want to, maybe I'll post this too, but Fareed Zakaria interviewed Bannon and asked him about this, and Bannon elaborates on his view, which is certainly worth checking out. Okay, number 5 is growing tolerance for unflattering and explicitly racial stereotypes, humor, and insults in popular mainstream culture directed at Asians. So here, actually, you can see this in a way if you look at how Asians are sort of portrayed in mainstream American society. And you find this like the older stereotype of Indian Americans that was in mainstream society was like Apu in The Simpsons, like kind of this fresh off the boat immigrant, kind of clueless, socially inept with a thick accent, but ultimately basically benign and that sort of. But that stereotype is it's morphing and changing, especially with the rise of sort of Indian Americans really shedding a lot of this sort of immigrant culture and moving more into mainstream American society. And you can find actually some examples here, and I'm going to talk more about this. But there's a piece here in the magazine, N+1 magazine. This is it's like a highbrow leftist Marxist sort of a publication, and the piece here it gets into it in part. It's called it's written by the editors. The title is White Indians, and I'll talk more about this piece later. But one of the things that it talks about is this. One of the things that they lament here is basically that as Indian Americans are increasing in their financial and ethnic and political clout, that white guilt is the way it's manifesting is that they're sort of creating the perception of having a multi-ethnic, multicultural workforce of representation by bringing in more and more Indian Americans into the fold. One of the ways that they're doing it, and the article talks about this, is that they portray Indian Americans in sort of unflattering ways. And they kind of like deride and make fun of aspects of Indian American culture and society that, in a sense, attribute or account for the success of the community. So for example, they might portray like a traditional Indian auntie, like yelling at her son about not getting good grades or whatever. And the article basically kind of talks about how Indian Americans often, for the sake of their own promotion in Hollywood and other areas, they kind of willingly acquiesce to these unflattering stereotypes. But these are sort of I think one of the things you're going to find is that increasingly portrayals of Indian Americans are going to resemble more and more a lot of the avaricious stereotypes that more traditionally have been associated with Jewish Americans, like the trope of the greedy banker or like the cheating businessman or whatever else. And I think you're probably going to end up seeing that more and more. Number 6 is a steady increase in hate crimes directed at the nation. This is already happening. You can pull up the data on your own, but this is particularly, in my view, likely to happen in mixed urban areas with high numbers of African American or Latino populations, but also mixed with a high percentage of like middle class Asian small business owners. This already happened to some degree in the 80s in New Jersey. There was this group called the Dot Busters, which were getting upset by Indian growth in Edison, New Jersey. This happened in an earlier time during the civil rights movement between tensions between African Americans and Jewish Americans. And actually, if you talk to older like Jewish Americans today who lived through the civil rights movement, they'll kind of mutter things like, well, after all that we did for them. And what they're basically alluding to is the fact that Jewish groups had played a very active role in championing the cause of civil rights. But ultimately that led to a dynamic where there was greater tension between African American groups and Jewish groups. Number 7 is greater tolerance in U.S. foreign policy for dictators and dictatorial regimes that are persecuting high-achieving minorities within their borders. Probably the ugliest example of this happening in an earlier period is when you look at the early days of the Nazi regime and when it was starting to become clear what that meant for Jews in Europe, that you had a lot of very powerful Americans that were basically, kind of winking and nodding or sympathetic to this because they were viewing this persecution abroad in the context of their own aggrievements and resentments at home. The Kennedys are probably the most infamous example of where, basically there's now transcripts and whatever of these early meetings between the Kennedy patriarch and the Nazis, basically saying really ugly things like, I completely understand why this is happening. And I think that probably where it's likely to manifest today, in particular in Southeast Asia, where you have basically these populist thugs like Duterte and others, in the form of populism and kind of representing those that have been forgotten, that this is going to manifest against crackdowns against, for example, Chinese diasporas. This actually happened during the Asian financial crisis in the 90s, where I've talked about this in earlier videos, that there was a very serious backlash against Chinese minority groups in Southeast Asia at the peak of the Asian financial crisis. And I think you're just going to basically see American leaders viewing human rights atrocities against high-achieving minority groups through the context of their own resentments at home, and basically not really recognize a salient American interest in doing anything about it. And then number 8 will be a shift in white America from feelings of what historically what has been called white supremacy being this theory that whites as a racial group are superior to others, to growing sympathy for quote, white nationalism. White nationalism being less concerned about which group is so-called objectively superior or inferior, more just with the idea that whites as a coherent bloc ought to identify as whites, and that they deserve their own space to protect their own culture. And you've already basically seen this. I've written about it with the rise of the alt-right and other things, that if you really look at this newfound identitarianism, and it's manifesting on the right now, but I think that it's going to become a left-wing phenomenon in a different way as well. Basically, what you have is this growing idea that of white Americans losing their faith or losing their allegiance to more cosmopolitan, race-neutral forms of identity in favor of more explicitly identitarian forms of identity or membership where they die with other whites. And they basically argue that we don't care if Asians are doing better at math or they're contributing to the economy or whatever. We want to be with our own people in our own neighborhoods. We want to preserve the sanctity of our communities, and that could manifest in any number of different ways. Now, in order to illustrate this, one of the things that I wanted to do is draw your attention to 2 articles, both of which I think I disagree with both of them, but I think they're a fascinating reflection of this phenomenon that I'm talking about. I think one of the things that's worth mentioning just off the bat is that when you're trying to really understand and forecast different trends in American society, one of the effective ways that I found of doing that is to really focus on the writings and the literature of very smart intellectual people at the fringes of different debates. And these are people who are basically, for the most part, writing not because they're paid think tank, or they're chasing tenure at some institution or whatever. They're writing because out of intellectual interest and curiosity, and at the end of the day, their constituency and their ability to write depends on gaining a loyal readership or following. And especially now on the internet, where people can anonymously find and resonate with whatever they want to without anyone doing anything, that I think the traffic that these sort of more fringe publications are getting is often a barometer for things to come. And you can see that. I mean, it's just incredible. The surge in the amount of traffic of publications online, both on the far right and the far left, who are basically talking about issues in a frank way that does not happen in the mainstream. And so I want to draw your attention here to an exchange between a far left and a far right group, both of which for different reasons come to the same conclusions about Indian Americans. So I mentioned this article before, I'll bring it up here again. The title is White Indians. It's in the spring of 2013. Very smart, intelligent article. I learned a lot from it, and I recommend checking it out. But what these editors are doing is basically coming from a sort of a neo-Marxist perspective. What they're basically saying is that, look, people on the left have long decried a lack of ethnic diversity in American media and TV and whatever. But one of the things that's happening is that, now what you're seeing is that there is more diversity, but it's coming from a greater inclusion of Indian Americans. And one of the reasons why this is happening is because Indian Americans generally are becoming so successful in American society. And so they're providing like the perfect way for whites to, on the one hand, assuage their racial guilt, but on the other hand, to basically maintain their own power and influence in American society by showing that they're inclusive. And so the gist of the article basically is that this is a problem all around, because on the one hand, they go after Indian Americans themselves for taking pride in the achievements of the community, and I want to pull up here I want to pull up the quote here exactly, but they basically say that, in fact, here, if you can just wait a second, I'll actually just pull up the quote. So they're, basically the article is talking about how successful Indian Americans have become. So they say here, okay, that all these achievements are, quote, sources of unctuous pride for South Asians, both in America and the mother countries. If no American minority but Jews is as powerful, surely no minority is as smug. So they're basically calling out Indian Americans for being proud of their achievements. And then they basically, go on to say that, well, first of all, Indian Americans shouldn't really take pride in these achievements because they have to do with a whole array of other forms of problems. And then they go on to talk about the common left-wing sources of grievance, racism, and whatever else. And then they basically say, look, that when you have this minority group that's coming to power, they're successful or whatever, that's actually a threat to this broader Marxist liberal project, where now it basically pits and draws a sharp contrast between a so-called successful group like Indian Americans and then the problems and pathologies of groups like African Americans and Latinos, all the while basically creating a rationale for continued white dominance. So you have here this critique of and concern about Indian American achievement coming from the left. Now, so in response to this article, I found another one that came a few years later, and this is by an author named Hubert Collins, who is writing for VDare. Now, VDare is a I don't know what you would call it. I guess it's more like a alt-right kind of a conservative publication. They're more identitarian. They generally take on a lot of racial issues from the perspective of so-called white interests. And okay, so the article here is you can see it here. The title is quote, "Blacks with Brains." This is like a pejorative for Indian Americans that's apparently used. I hadn't heard of it, but the title is "Blacks with Brains, Indian Leftists Show Downside of Merit-Based Immigration." So what this article talks about is, it's a very serious article, and I urge you to read it. But Collins basically talks about how this Indian American community in the U.S. is defined by an extraordinarily high IQ, and that in part due to their cognitive advantages that they have, they're basically achieving much greater clout in American society. And he talks about sort of Indian American achievement in different sectors. But then what he talks about here is that, this is a problem. And he says because, and this is where the blacks with brains issue comes in. He says that as Indian Americans come to power and come to the fore intellectually, they're different in the way they engage with politics from sort of from African American writers or Latino writers, in the sense that those groups tend to focus more on airing the grievances of their own communities. But with Indian Americans, because they're sophisticated writers and thinkers and whatever, they write in a more cosmopolitan way. They invent certain ideas, but Collins argues here that these ideas, this worldview, this engagement from Indian Americans ultimately comes at the expense, as he sees it, of the interests of white Americans and the dominant group. So he's basically arguing when you have merit-based immigration, yeah, the economy improves, but you end up with a different political and social dynamic that disadvantages whites. And actually, contrary here, in a way, the title of the article is misleading, because he says Indian leftists show downside of merit-based immigration, but he goes on basically to criticize prominent Indian American conservatives. Also, he ends up attacking Nikki Haley for taking on the Confederate flag in South Carolina. He goes on, he criticizes Dinesh D'Souza for some of the tiffs that he had with white nationalist groups and whatever. So, basically he's articulating from the right this critique of Indian Americans. And, one of the things that I found when I was researching the alt-right is that they speak in a very racialized way, in a way that makes people uncomfortable. But if you actually look at their policy demands, in my view, they're not all that far off from where the white Republican base is and today, whether it's on immigration, whether it's on a whole array of different issues. If you really just look at concretely their critique or their demands, they're already there, and a lot of studies that are coming out basically showing that identitarian grievances, more than anything, are what propelled Trump to power and so forth. So the question is, well, what do we do about it? And I think that I want to focus the prescriptive discussion here on how high-achieving minority groups ought to navigate the situation, because ultimately, in a sense, they're the ones who are going to deal with the fallout more than anything of how these trends evolve. But they're also, I would argue, in a position really to shape the debate also. Now, I think that there are broadly three paths that Indian Americans and other high-achieving minority groups can take. And I want to go through them and talk about the advantages and disadvantages, and then offer my own view on what needs to be done here. So one strategy, of course, is assimilation. And assimilation basically means that you over time, as you get further and further from the immigrant experience, you basically assimilate, absorb yourself into American culture, American society, and this is maybe like a manifestation of the traditional melting pot ideal. Now, the advantage, obviously, of assimilation is that when you're assimilated and you're basically no different from everyone else, that dampens the impetus for discrimination. The problem and the trouble, though, is that what assimilation would basically mean is taking this minority group that has just produced an enormous amount of wealth and clout, is just on such a positive trajectory, and basically assimilating into a culture that's going in the opposite direction. And what assimilation would basically mean is taking all these attributes of Indian Americans and other high-achieving minority groups, taking all the things that make them different, and basically now foregoing these advantages or giving them up. This is, and one of the books that I would urge you to think about, if you're interested in this, is a recent book by Amy Chua and her husband, Jed Rubenfeld, that both professors at Yale Law School. They wrote a book called The Triple Package, where they basically look at this question of why, they basically try to account or propose a theory for why certain ethnic groups tend to overperform in America and others don't. And one of the things that they found is that basically, so they identify a triple package. And one of the things that they find, which is an uncomfortable conclusion they reach, is that a big part of the reason why these minority groups do so well is because they have a private ethos that they often don't talk about publicly, but that is actually in marked contrast to the kind of ideals that mainstream society tries to inculcate. So like one of the examples that they bring up is a superiority complex. So in a culture where we're all taught to be equal, think of everyone as equal, etc., when you look at these high achieving minority groups, they have a very profound superiority complex. So where basically they tell themselves that they're better than others. So like Chinese Americans have this sort of civilizational view where China is the center of the universe. Jews obviously regard themselves as the chosen people. And one of the things that Chua and Rubenfeld argue is responsible for Indian American success is that they basically bring together all these this chip that they have, whether from the caste system or whatever. So like if they're Brahmins, they bring the superiority to the U.S. or you see it in Gujarati Americans, Gujaratis in the Indian American community. They're very proud of their entrepreneurial, business-like culture and tradition, and so they sort of think that they have an advantage. And whether or not these things are true or not, I mean, they're often mixed up with different mythologies. This belief in superiority, that you're like a better group and superior, can become a sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy where the belief leads in fact to greater achievement or outcomes. I think this is particularly complicated, the assimilation path too, because the ultimate in assimilation obviously is interracial marriage. And when you just look at what the realities are of certain Asian groups and so forth trying to embark on this path where they're encouraging interracial marriage, this isn't necessarily going to put Asian Americans at especially Asian American males at an advantage in these markets. And you're seeing that with Jewish Americans who have, to a large degree, taken a assimilation path. When you look at the high degrees of outgroup marriage among Jewish Americans relative to their European counterparts, I think that over time this is going to erode a lot of the advantages that the Jewish American community has built up for itself. You actually, in a way, you see this assimilation strategy playing out with the decline of the Episcopalian establishment in America. And we don't really talk about it in this way, but with the Episcopalian establishment in America, what you really had was this very small kind of religious, kind of ethnic social group that was really at the pinnacle of American society. And within a very short period of time in the 20th century, they basically lost it all. And when you look at like IQ distributions in the US, Episcopalian IQs, they're at the very top with Indians and Jews. But when you look at actually the output or the power or the influence of Episcopalians in America, it just isn't really there anymore. And I think a big part of that was a choice that Episcopalians made, basically to renounce some of this self-confident WASP culture and assimilate more into mainstream society. So this would be my critique of the assimilation model. The second model would be a more status quo model, which has allowed high-achieving minority groups to basically come to the fore. And that is basically, it's a strategy where it's more of like a mixed salad, to use the metaphor, where basically they partake in American society, they compete in mainstream American institutions, but they do so by preserving many of their own traditions and attributes. And so, for example, if you look at Mormons are probably like the longest standing model of this, where basically they go to business school, they compete in different enterprises, they engage in politics, but they also have a very insular and unique community with different traditions, different privileges for the group, and then they basically kind of balance a certain tightrope where they preserve their own identity. They, for example, strongly discourage out-group marriage and other things, but they also, at the end of the day, aren't just going into isolation. They're competing in mainstream society. Now, I would offer, this is obviously a model that in some ways accounts for why high-achieving minority groups have become that in the first place. But the problem with it, as I talked about in the beginning of this talk, is that depends. First of all, it's hard to maintain. I mean, when you're living in a multi-ethnic, multicultural society with greater and greater opportunities for mobility and whatever, it just becomes harder to enforce a lot of these norms and cohesion. But two, even if you can figure out a way to do it, as Mormons, for example, have done, the problem, as I talk about, is that this also relies to some degree on a certain baseline level of tolerance or acquiescence by the dominant group in American society. And while the trend line has broadly favored acceptance and inclusion and tolerance over the course of the 20th century, if my argument is correct, we're probably at the beginning of a backlash where a lot of this cosmopolitanism, these norms are going in the other direction. Often when you bring up these historic examples of that I talked about earlier in the talk, like the Chinese in Southeast Asia or the Jews in Europe or whatever, people sort of tune out because they think it's alarmist and they think that well, it can't happen here. And I'm not predicting mass atrocities or anything like that. I think American society has a certain foundation and culture and tradition that probably makes us immune from that. But one of the realities to look at is that when you do see these major atrocities or backlashes happening against high-achieving minority groups, they often happen very, very quickly in a short, unexpected period of time. And it doesn't take much to really bring out the latent ugliness in us. I think one of the best examples here is in Southeast Asia, where you look at the what happened in the 97 Asian financial crisis, where there were these longstanding tensions, but with this economic pressure, like almost overnight, you just see an outburst of this, and so one has to think about with this strategy, what happens if we have another financial crisis? What if the 08 financial crisis had happened and there wasn't a bailout or something to sort of tamp over the edges? I mean, how would this have shaken out? My prediction is probably not particularly well for certain ethnic groups. So this brings up a third option, and this is the one that I'm going to endorse and make an argument for, which is that high-achieving minority groups ought to reconceptualize their own identity and embark on a different strategy that is more cosmopolitan, more globalist in nature, and that basically does not, to the same degree, peg its fortunes to the United States, and really diversifies its portfolio and tries to perpetuate its advantage in different ways. Now, I would argue that there should be broadly three elements of this kind of a plan or strategy. I think number one, it begins internally, and I think one of the big contributions of a lot of the self-help or self-development literature is basically that any kind of change that we want to manifest in the world ultimately comes from within, comes from our own beliefs, the terms and words that we use, the way we think of ourselves. And I think right now, one of the things that high-achieving minority groups have in common is that they all view themselves as being, at the end of the day, Americans. And they view themselves as being part of the history and traditions of American culture. They feel, whatever ties they might have to other countries, they ultimately feel like they're more accepted in this culture. And that's why you see among immigrant groups that they often are able to perform at such a high level too, is because they have a very unironic sense of patriotism. A lot of the cynicism that you might see from native foreign populations doesn't set in when they realize that they can come here and be judged on the merits, judged on their skill. But what I would argue is that it may be time to have a more cosmopolitan view where we recognize that actually, whether it's Indian Americans or Asian Americans or whatever group we're talking about, that while we've had a good run in the US, we're not at the end of the day American, but we're a unique group that's different, that's insular, and that can really replicate and grow its advantages anywhere in the world, whether or not trends in the US are in their favor. And so this might mean a more transactional relationship with American society in favor of a more globalist approach where we're laying down different roots, different connections, more of an interest in other countries around the world. And just thinking about this in terms of our own identity and how we view the world, that I think just making this mental shift is going to produce a cascade of other insights. The second I would say is in the realm of investments and financial management. And one of the things that can, when you look at how these atrocities have shaken out in other societies, well before at least any kind of killing or mass reprisals, one of the first things that majority or majoritarian societies will do is basically seize the assets of these high achieving minority groups. Now, I talked earlier in this talk about how I think that's already happening with progressive taxation and regulation and so forth, which is basically a genteel way of using the power of the state to take from certain groups and whatnot. But much of the wealth in American society that these high achieving minority groups have are in the form of assets that could very easily be confiscated. I think real estate is a very obvious example, but even when you think about bank accounts, different forms of property, they're all the only thing really preventing these sort of resources or whatever from being confiscated is an American legal judicial system that offers the right checks and balances. But the reality is, in a majoritarian society with certain public policy norms, the American system is not necessarily one that you want to bet on. And I think this is why I've become more interested in things like gaining multiple passports, opening offshore bank accounts, acquiring many different citizenships, and just generally diversifying. Another thing here that could be done is pursuing occupations or pursuing ways of gaining wealth that are more location independent rather than location dependent. So, for example, if you work in that might mean, for example, investing in a service business that you can pack up and locate somewhere else that isn't necessarily tied to being in a particular location or area. And then obviously when you have a location independent income streams, that also gives you the liberty to diversify globally, form new networks, new connections, and basically now move around to different parts of the world. And as with the US, take a more transactional approach to other countries. If they offer a rule of law and a favorable business climate and culture of tolerance, you go there and you take advantage of it, but you're also prepared and ready to leave whenever you need to, whenever trends start to go the other way. And all the Americans have believing that they're a unique entrepreneurial, liberal, capitalist society. I mean, the reality is that there are any number of ways to diversify around the world, as I've talked about before, where you can take advantage of global arbitrage, you can take advantage of favorable tax havens, where you can have much more individual freedom and autonomy. And then the final, by the way, just one point here, and I had done a earlier video. I was talking to a friend of mine, David Lesbrons, who's one of these lawyers, advisors who helps people basically globalize their finances and move offshore and whatever. And he was saying that I was asking him, where do your clients come from? Like, who are the people who really get it? And he was saying a lot of them actually come from, they come from all over the world, but a lot of them come from groups or nationalities or ethnicities where they've already been through this process before, where they've already had the experience of having their land or their businesses or whatever confiscated by some tragedy. And actually, we talked about the Chinese and Southeast Asia. Another group actually is when you look at Indians who lived through partition with the collapse of the British Empire. A lot of these groups had a lot of their wealth confiscated in the course of partition, and they now intuitively understand that you have to mitigate some political risk here. And then the final the final thing the final strategy that I would advise for high achieving minority groups is to rethink the way they engage in politics. And I think right now, although you do see certain minority groups tending to gravitate to one political party or the other, like Indian Americans tend to be more a Democrat. I think my understanding is that Mormons tend to be more Republican. The reality is that at the end of the day, you're seeing more and more as these high achieving minority groups, as they gain wealth and influence, the reaction tends to be that they dive into the political process as equals. They really take part in the whole array of issues in American society. They seek elected office. They basically view themselves as being participants in this broader American discussion. What I would urge instead is not necessarily a retreat, but much more of an emphasis on really, whatever differences there are within communities, to form common cause with other high achieving minority groups and recognize that whatever our different political orientations or perspectives, that there are certain core issues that we have to unify on and really devote the bulk of our engagement and enthusiasm and so forth to really hedge against a majoritarian culture that may feel otherwise. I would put in this category, for example, the ones that I would emphasize would be tax rates, really making sure that we have low taxes, fair taxes that are not being targeted toward sort of high power corridors in our society where that have traditionally sort of catapulted or accounted for wealth creation for minority groups. It would be in the high finance sector. It might be on an issue like carried interest. It might be in the tech sector where taxes and other forms of government intervention could have a disproportionate ethnic effect. Another thing that I would maintain would be just having generally an attitude that tends to lean in the direction of limited government. Because the reality is that the more government grows, the more the police power of the state grows, you now have an instrument or the ingredients for the state now to turn against the interests of minority groups. Another one I would argue is really focusing on a pro-immigration, but not only immigration, just a more generally open borders agenda. So this would mean an emphasis on visa-free travel. It would be a permissive regime where capital and labor can flow easily. It would be a free trade regime where different goods and services can flow, and ultimately making sure that there are adequate protections for people and groups who want to renounce their American citizenship. Actually, and you can see this, I mean, it's very, very ugly that when Eduardo Saverin, the founder of Facebook, decided to renounce his American citizenship and go to Singapore to benefit from fairer tax treatment, you had Chuck Schumer just give this very angry demagogic speech on and he's like, how dare these people use the US to make money and then flee, it's outrageous. And then he basically proposed us greater fees and fines and other things that would basically make it harder for people to renounce their citizenship. And I think these kinds of policies really need to be fought back against. And then the final two issues I would name here. One is affirmative action. I think there absolutely needs to be a concerted effort to break down, to resist greater use of affirmative action in our society. to resist ethnic and racial quotas, to make sure that we have a judiciary that's ready to strike down affirmative action laws and hold them unconstitutional. Because if you have merit-based competition, open competition, just having a fair competition, this is what's going to allow high-achieving minority groups with a certain capital, intellectual capital, cognitive capital, and so forth to continue to grow and be a dynamic, vibrant community. And then the final thing that I want to talk about is an emphasis on global human rights, and basically recognizing that when you have a culture, when you have a global order that is that takes seriously the rights of people everywhere, that recognizes that there are certain human rights, human ideals that are there to protect everyone, regardless of where someone's born or what country they live in or whatever. And we have a foreign policy and an outlook that really reflects that. That's going to sort of nip in the bud extremist movements from elsewhere in the world from spreading. And it's also going to just force high-achieving minority groups to recognize that even in this cocoon of America, when you see a Chinese group in Southeast Asia, or you see a tribe in Nigeria, or you see Jews in Europe or Russia or whatever facing discrimination, this isn't just their problem, but it's really an assault on the human rights that form the foundation of a tolerant global order where groups can be successful and so forth. Okay, that's all I have. I've been thinking maybe this was obviously a bit disjointed, but maybe taking the transcript of this and turning it into some kind of an article or maybe a book or whatever. So if you're in any way in agreement or broadly sympathetic with what I've said, and you want to maybe collaborate on some kind of a project, I'd be very eager. So anyway, let me know what you think, and I'll talk to you soon.